Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking more about the theory of evolution. While pretty much all scientists agree that evolution is happening, there's still a lot of debate about what the process actually looks like. So we're going to be going over the kind of two main theories of what evolution actually looks like today. Okay, so for this lesson, we're going to be going over the difference between convergent, divergent, and parallel evolution. We're then going to look at the theories of gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. You do need to know how the fossil record relates to both of those, as well as the different stages of punctuated equilibrium. And then lastly, we're briefly going to touch on the trend of global diversification and extinction. Okay, so when we're classifying evolution, we can classify it based on the traits and genes that are present. Sometimes we compare the evolutionary history of different species, or we organize it based on the rates. So first, convergent evolution. This is a type of evolution that occurs between species that are not at all closely related, but they evolve to become more similar over time. So two unrelated species evolving similar traits over time. They are converging in that they are becoming more similar over time. So their traits will not be evolutionarily or genetically related, but they will look the same. So convergent evolution is how you end up with analogous traits. Usually it happens when you have two unrelated species that have similar habitats or similar selective forces. Convergent evolution can make species look like they're related even though they're not. The opposite of that is divergent evolution, where you have two closely related species that have a similar ancestor, but over time they evolve to be very different from one another. So they are diverging away from one another. This usually happens following a speciation event when you no longer have gene flow between the species, and so they accumulate different adaptations over time. Even though the species are related, they might not look very related because they're going to be evolving different traits. Usually this happens when closely related species end up living in very different environments with different selective forces. And then parallel evolution is when you have two species that are like kind of, semi-closely related, and then they evolve in the same way. So they're evolving parallel to one another. They start off similarly related and they end up similarly related looking. Usually it happens when somewhat closely related species end up having the same type of selective forces applied to them because they live in similar habitats. So this is kind of like how we would represent this. So divergent, they start off the same, they evolve differently from one another. Parallel, they start off the same, they end up the same even though they've both changed. And convergent, when they start off different, but they evolve to be similar over time. An example of divergent evolution would be the evolution of all mammals. We all came from an ancestral mammal, but we have evolved to be very, very different from one another. A example of convergent evolution would be, say, a bird, a mammal, and a reptile, all ending up with similar traits. You've got birds and bats, and in this case, pterodactyls, that all ended up with wings. So they've all ended up with this similar trait, even though none of them are closely related at all. And then parallel evolution would be with these like finches over here that have all evolved over time to still be very similar looking to each other. Okay, so all of those different types of evolution are happening. They are just different ways that species evolve. Now we're going to get to the two different theories of evolution that are both trying to describe how evolution is happening on over billions of years. And these are the two different theories that scientists are kind of like debating on which one is the real way that evolution is happening. And it could be that it's a mixture of these two. So the first theory is gradualism. This theory says that evolution takes place at a slow, uniform pace. So it's a slow and steady change that is happening. This would mean that evolution is made up of very small changes to the species that just accumulate over a very long time. It's based on the evolutionary theories by Hutton and Lyell. And it's not super supported by the fossil record. In the fossil record, we see species staying the same for a really long time and then a big change. However, gradualists argue that that's just because we're missing so much of the fossil record. There are so many like missing links in our fossil record that we haven't discovered and may never discover, because as we talked about in an earlier lesson, a lot of species just don't fossilize. The other theory is called punctuated equilibrium, and this one is based on what we actually see in the fossil record, where a species stays the same and then very abruptly changes. This theory says that species evolve really rapidly in terms of evolutionary time, so that it's happening over like, you know, hundreds or thousands of years, not tens of thousands of years. Speciation occurs in small, isolated population, and that's why we don't usually find those missing links or the intermediate fossils. Evolution appears to take those sharp jumps because missing links are so rare. And then once a species has evolved, it stays the same for a long period of time. So yeah, essentially it's saying that you have this period of stasis, or the species staying the same for a long period of time. Then you'll have this very, very rapid change, where that would be where like your intermediate species would be. But because it's happening so quickly and in such an isolated population, we don't have a lot of fossils for those intermediate species. Those missing fossils are called the missing links. And then once the change has kind of expanded and taken over, you have that stasis again. That's what's being shown down here again. So you have, you know, this original species, you have a new species evolving, but the missing link is not being preserved, essentially because it only shows up for such a small period of time in terms of geographic time, because the change happens so rapidly. We have, by the way, found some missing links. The Archaeopteryx is the missing link between birds and reptiles. It is a fossil that has traits of both birds and reptiles, but those kind of missing links are rare. Okay, so these are the different stages of punctuated equilibrium. Number one, stasis. The population is stable, it's not changing. Next up, isolation, or a massive environmental change. Usually we just call it isolation. So part of the population becomes isolated, there is no gene flow. Next up, you have strong selection. So there is some sort of selective pressure on that isolated population. So something that, like the environment changes, or there's not enough food to go around, or there's a lot of competition, some sort of strong selective pressure, which causes that isolated population to evolve very rapidly. So it changes very rapidly. And then the last step is expansion, where that newly evolved species expands its range and then outcompetes the original species. And then it would go back to stasis again. So this is kind of what it looks like. We start off with this population of snails in stasis. Then you have part of the population becoming isolated, in this case because the sea level dropped down and isolated this little population over here. That little isolated population is now experiencing different environmental conditions. So it's going to have a selective force on it. That selective force causes it to evolve very, very quickly, in this case to have a bigger shell. And then that population expands and outcompetes the original small-shelled population. So that's the expansion and out-competition, whatever, phase. And then it would go back to stasis again. Okay, so this is kind of like what the two different theories of evolution would look like. With gradualism, you just have this slow, steady change of one species to the next that happens like so slowly that it's hard to tell where one species starts and the next, or one species ends and the next one starts. With punctuated equilibrium, you have these long periods of time where the species isn't changing at all, and then it quickly evolves, and then it stays stable for a long period of time, and then quickly evolves, and then stays stable for a long period of time. And again, this is kind of what it would look like in terms of like a phylogenetic tree. With gradualism, you would just see this slow change over time into two different species. With punctuated equilibrium, it would happen much more abruptly. Okay, so that's it for the two different theories of evolution. Next up, we're briefly going to touch on diversification. So over Earth's history, life on Earth has become more diverse. So we've had more different species. So Earth experiences times of great diversification where there's lots and lots of speciation happening. And then every now and then there will be an extinction event, which will decrease the number of species, decrease Earth's diversity. But then following that event, diversity will start to increase again. The overall trend is an increase in diversity over time. Most species that have ever existed in Earth's past are now extinct. Most extinctions occur due to natural evolutionary processes, things like competition and natural selection. That's called the background extinction rate, and it is fairly low. Then there's also mass extinction events where a huge chunk of the species that are on Earth go extinct all at once because of some sort of major change in Earth's condition. So an example of this is the Permian extinction, also called the Great Dying, where over 96% of the species on Earth went extinct. They think it's probably because of tectonic plate movement. That's when Earth was much younger and the tectonic plates were moving around a lot faster. And there's a lot more volcanic eruptions associated with that. So this is kind of this general pattern. At the bottom here is like when Earth was just a baby and we had the first kind of life on Earth. And then over time, as this gets wider, that's more species. Anytime it's cutting in where those like red lines are, that is an extinction event. And then you can see following the extinction event, the number of species increases, and then there's another extinction event, and it goes up over and over and over again. Yeah, this one here is one you guys might be familiar with, the extinction of the dinosaurs, which they were probably finished off by an asteroid impact, though climate change from volcanic eruptions and stuff probably put them on the edge. Okay, that is it for today's lesson. Let me know if you have any questions about this stuff.